put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The $350 trillion lie. Every morning at 11 a.m. London time, a number appeared. Just a simple percentage. A decimal point, a few digits. Unremarkable to most people. But this number, this single rate, controlled the price of money itself. It determined mortgage payments in Manchester and credit card rates in Mumbai. It influenced student loans in Seattle and business financing in São Paulo. Over $350 trillion in financial contracts. More money than exists in the entire global economy. Moved according to this one daily calculation. The London Interbank Offered Rate, LIBOR. For decades, the world trusted this number the way sailors trust the North Star. Banks, governments, corporations, ordinary people, all of them built their financial lives on the assumption that LIBOR represented truth. But what if it didn't? What if the most important number in global finance was nothing more than a gentleman's agreement between liars? What if the banks entrusted with reporting the truth had spent years in shadowy trading rooms, manipulating the very foundation of the world's economy for profit? This is the story of the greatest financial conspiracy in history. A dark business story where the criminals wore Savile Row suits and worked in glass towers overlooking the Thames, where traders joked about rigging the system in instant messages, never imagining their words would become evidence in the largest corporate scandal the world had ever seen, where the lies were so big, so fundamental, that even after the truth emerged, most people couldn't comprehend the scale of the betrayal. Welcome to the dark side of business. Welcome to the LIBOR scandal. To understand how banks manipulated global interest rates, you first need to understand what LIBOR actually was. On the surface, it seemed simple enough. Every business day, a panel of the world's largest banks submitted estimates to the British Bankers Association. The question they answered: at what rate could you borrow unsecured funds from other banks today? These submissions, from institutions like Barclays, Deutsche Bank, JPMorgan Chase, UBS, and Citigroup, were collected. The highest and lowest numbers were trimmed away, and the remaining rates were averaged. The result became LIBOR, published daily in multiple currencies and timeframes. 3-month dollar LIBOR, 6-month sterling LIBOR, rates that theoretically reflected the real cost of money in the interbank market. But here's where the shadows begin to creep in. LIBOR wasn't based on actual transactions. It was based on estimates, educated guesses, banks reporting what they thought they could borrow at, not what they actually borrowed at. And nobody verified these numbers. Nobody checked if they reflected reality. The entire system ran on trust, the assumption that massive financial institutions would never lie about something so fundamental to the global economy. That assumption was catastrophically wrong. The manipulation began quietly, in the hushed conversations of trading floors where money and greed flow like electricity through copper wire. Derivatives traders, the cowboys of the financial world, quickly realized something the rest of us never considered. Their bonuses depended on the performance of complex financial instruments tied to LIBOR. Interest rate swaps, futures contracts, exotic derivatives worth billions. If LIBOR moved up or down by just a tiny fraction, even a single basis point, 0.01%, it could mean millions in profit or loss. And the people submitting their bank's LIBOR estimates sat just a few desks away. At Barclays Bank in London, a trader would instant message a colleague in the LIBOR submission team, not a formal request through compliance channels, Not a documented business communication, just a casual chat between friends. Can you put in a high 3-month dollar LIBOR today? Or, need you to keep 6-month yen as low as possible? Sometimes there was politeness. If you could see your way to a low 1-month fix, it would help. Sometimes there were promises. I'll pay you, big boy. Sometimes there were threats wrapped in jokes. I'm begging you, don't forget about my fix. And the LIBOR submitters complied. They adjusted their estimates, not to reflect market reality, but to benefit their colleagues' trading positions. In return, they received bottles of champagne, promises of future favors, the camaraderie of being part of the team. What they were doing seemed small, almost victimless, moving a number up or down by a few basis points. Who would even notice? The answer: hundreds of millions of people whose mortgages, loans, and financial futures were tied to these lies. But they wouldn't know for years. This business crime wasn't limited to one bank or one trading desk. The conspiracy spread like a virus through the bloodstream of global finance. Traders at different banks, supposedly fierce competitors, began collaborating. They shared information about their desired LIBOR levels. They coordinated their manipulation. A trader at UBS would contact a broker at ICAP, one of the intermediaries facilitating interbank trades. The broker would then reach out to traders at other banks, building a coalition of manipulation. "Thanks for your help with the LIBOR fix," one UBS trader wrote to a broker. "I'll do the same for you one day." The language they used reveals everything about their mindset. The fix. They called it the fix, as if they were drug dealers or mafia enforcers, not employees of institutions entrusted with the stability of the global financial system. As if rigging the most important number in finance was just another day at the office. Between 2005 and 2009, these conspiracies operated in plain sight, hidden only by the assumption that such massive fraud was unthinkable. Traders became increasingly brazen, documenting their crimes in instant messages and emails that would later seem almost comically incriminating. "Done. For you, big boy," wrote one Barclays submitter after rigging a rate. A trader responded, "Dude, I owe you big time. Come over one day after work, and I'm opening a bottle of Bollinger." They celebrated their manipulation like it was a game they were winning. And in a sense, they were. Every day the lies continued was another day of profit extracted from a system built on trust. But then came September 2008, and everything changed. When Lehman Brothers collapsed and the global financial crisis erupted like a volcano, the LIBOR manipulation entered a new, darker phase. The game was no longer about traders boosting their bonuses. Now it was about survival. Banks lying to hide their own weakness. Institutions on the brink of collapse, submitting artificially low LIBOR rates to convince the world they were still healthy. Think about the psychology of this moment. The entire financial system was in freefall. Banks were hoarding cash, terrified to lend to each other because nobody knew who would be the next to fail. Credit markets froze. Panic spread through trading floors like wildfire. And LIBOR, which was supposed to reflect how much it cost banks to borrow from each other, should have skyrocketed. But it didn't. Not enough anyway. Because banks were submitting false rates, deliberately understating their borrowing costs to avoid appearing desperate. If a bank submitted a high LIBOR estimate, it would signal to the market that other banks considered them a credit risk. It would be like bleeding in shark-infested waters. Short sellers would attack their stock. Depositors might panic and pull their money. Counterparties might refuse to do business. The bank could die from the perception of weakness alone. So they lied. All of them together in a conspiracy of silence. Senior executives at major banks knew about the manipulation and approved it, either explicitly or through willful blindness. Compliance officers who raised concerns were ignored or silenced. Risk managers who questioned the integrity of LIBOR submissions were told it was more important to protect the bank's reputation. The lies became institutional policy, flowing from trading desks all the way up to corner offices overlooking the City of London and Wall Street. At Barclays, internal documents would later show that senior management discussed LIBOR manipulation at the height of the crisis. One executive noted that their LIBOR submissions were patently too low, and that other banks were potentially misleading the market. But instead of reporting the fraud, Barclays joined it, lowering their own submissions to avoid standing out. The conspiracy had evolved. What started as rogue traders gaming the system for profit had metastasized into something far more sinister, a coordinated effort by the world's most powerful financial institutions to lie about their own solvency while the global economy burned. Regulators would later estimate that during the crisis, LIBOR was being suppressed by 30 to 40 basis points. It doesn't sound like much, but on $350 trillion in contracts, those fractions of a percent represented hundreds of billions of dollars in mispriced risk. Pension funds, municipalities, small businesses, homeowners, all of them were on the wrong side of trades they didn't even know they were making, because the price of money itself was a lie. This wasn't just a corporate scandal. It was a betrayal of the entire financial system. The first cracks in the conspiracy appeared not from regulators or whistleblowers, but from journalists and academics who noticed something didn't add up. In April 2008, a Wall Street Journal article questioned why LIBOR rates seemed divorced from reality during the early stages of the credit crisis. The piece suggested banks might be understating their borrowing costs. The financial industry dismissed the concerns. The British Bankers Association, the organization overseeing LIBOR, insisted the rate was reliable. Banks denied any manipulation. The lies continued. But investigators were beginning to pay attention. In the United States, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission started examining LIBOR manipulation in 2008. In the UK, the Financial Services Authority launched its own probe. In Japan, Switzerland, Canada, and across Europe, regulators began connecting dots that would eventually expose the largest price-fixing conspiracy in history. The investigation took years because the fraud was so pervasive, so embedded in the daily operations of global banking, that untangling it required analyzing millions of emails, instant messages, phone calls, and trading records. Investigators had to piece together a business crime that involved hundreds of traders, dozens of banks, and stretched across multiple continents and currencies. And what they found was worse than anyone had imagined. The evidence painted a picture of systematic fraud running through the heart of modern finance like rot through a tree. Instant messages revealed traders treating LIBOR manipulation as routine. "It's just amazing how LIBOR fixing can make you that much money," wrote one UBS trader. "It's a cartel now in London," wrote another. At Deutsche Bank, investigators found traders colluding with competitors to rig rates in their favor. At Royal Bank of Scotland, managers were aware of manipulation, but took no action to stop it. At Citigroup, traders coordinated LIBOR submissions with counterparts at other banks, sharing information about their positions and desired rate movements. The scandal wasn't an aberration. It was the culture. On June 27, 2012, the world learned the truth when Barclays became the first bank to settle with regulators. The institution admitted to manipulating LIBOR and would pay $450 million in fines. At the time, the largest penalty ever imposed for banking misconduct. But the money was almost irrelevant compared to the revelations contained in the settlement documents. The public could now read, in the traders' own words, how casually they had rigged the system. The champagne promises, the big boy favors, the explicit requests to manipulate rates. The documents showed a financial culture that had completely lost touch with ethics, where fraud was treated as a perk of the job, and lying about the price of money was just another way to hit quarterly targets. The scandal destroyed careers at the highest levels. Bob Diamond, the charismatic CEO of Barclays and one of the most powerful figures in global banking, resigned in disgrace within days of the settlement. Marcus Agius, the bank's chairman, also stepped down. But these were just the first dominoes to fall. What happened next revealed the true scale of the conspiracy and sent shockwaves through boardrooms from London to Tokyo. Barclays wasn't an isolated case. It wasn't even the worst offender. The bank had simply been the first to cooperate with authorities, trading early settlement for a slightly reduced penalty. Behind them stood a queue of financial institutions, waiting for judgment. In December 2012, UBS, Switzerland's largest bank, agreed to pay $1.5 billion in fines, a record-breaking penalty that dwarfed Barclays' settlement. The evidence against UBS was devastating. More than 2,000 documented attempts to manipulate LIBOR and other benchmark rates. A culture of fraud so pervasive that even junior employees understood rate rigging was standard practice. One UBS trader had described the manipulation process in an email with chilling clarity. "We've been going higher on the LIBOR submissions to protect our franchise." Translation: "We've been lying about our borrowing costs to protect the bank's reputation, and everyone knows it." But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The evidence showed that UBS traders hadn't just manipulated rates to benefit their own positions, they had bribed brokers at ICAP and other intermediaries to help coordinate manipulation across multiple banks. Cash payments, lavish entertainment, even hired prostitutes, all documented in expense reports and instant messages that investigators would later uncover. This wasn't just a financial crime. It was organized corruption on a scale that belonged in a mafia thriller, except the criminals wore $1,000 suits and worked in air-conditioned offices with views of Lake Zurich. The settlements kept coming, each one larger and more damning than the last. Royal Bank of Scotland, $612 million in 2013. Rabobank, $1 billion in 2013. Deutsche Bank, $2.5 billion in 2015, the largest LIBOR-related penalty in history. JPMorgan Chase, Citigroup, Bank of America, HSBC, Société Générale, Crédit Agricole. The list of banks implicated in the scandal read like a directory of the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. By the time the investigations concluded, over 35 financial institutions had been fined for LIBOR manipulation, paying more than $9 billion in penalties. But even these staggering numbers fail to capture the true cost of the betrayal. Because while the banks paid fines, easily absorbed by institutions with hundreds of billions in assets, the real victims never received justice. Municipalities that had entered into interest rate swaps based on fraudulent LIBOR rates, pension funds whose investments were undermined by manipulated benchmarks, homeowners who paid artificially high mortgage rates when LIBOR was rigged upward, or received lower returns on their savings when it was suppressed, small businesses whose loan costs were determined by a number that banks were lying about every single day. The wealth transfer was massive and invisible, billions of dollars silently siphoned from those who trusted the system to those who rigged it. And because LIBOR manipulation was so complex and pervasive, calculating individual damages was nearly impossible. Most victims never even knew they'd been robbed. Class action lawsuits were filed in multiple countries, but they dragged on for years, often settling for fractions of the actual harm. The legal system, designed to handle conventional fraud, struggled to process a conspiracy that had infected the very bloodstream of global finance. What about criminal charges? Surely crimes this massive would send people to prison. In most countries, the answer was no. Banks paid fines, but executives walked free. The institutions took the punishment, while the individuals who orchestrated the fraud retired with their bonuses intact. It was the same pattern that had emerged after the 2008 financial crisis. Corporate penalties without personal accountability, fines without jail time, billion-dollar settlements that changed nothing about who wielded power in the financial system. But the United States took a different approach. Federal prosecutors brought criminal charges against individual traders, and some actually went to prison. Tom Hayes, a former UBS and Citigroup trader, became the first person convicted and sentenced in the LIBOR scandal, receiving 14 years in a UK prison in 2015, later reduced to 11 years. Hayes had been a brilliant trader, earning millions in bonuses by expertly gaming LIBOR rates. Now he became a cautionary tale, though many argued he was a scapegoat, a mid-level trader punished for a conspiracy that reached far higher in the corporate hierarchy. A handful of other traders received prison sentences in the UK and US, but out of thousands of people who knew about or participated in LIBOR manipulation, fewer than a dozen ever saw the inside of a cell. The message was clear. In the world of high finance, institutions might pay fines, but people, especially powerful people, rarely faced real consequences. The LIBOR scandal forced regulators to confront an uncomfortable truth. The entire benchmark rate system was fundamentally broken. A rate affecting $350 trillion in contracts was based on estimates rather than actual transactions, overseen by a private trade association rather than a government regulator, and submitted by banks with every incentive to lie. It was a system designed for a gentler era of finance, when a banker's word was his bond, and trust was the currency that mattered most. That era, if it ever truly existed, was long dead. In 2014, British regulators transferred oversight of LIBOR to the Financial Conduct Authority, removing it from the British Bankers Association. New rules required LIBOR submissions to be based on actual transaction data whenever possible. Compliance systems were strengthened, recording requirements enhanced, penalties for manipulation increased. But the fundamental problem remained. LIBOR was built on a market that was dying. After the 2008 crisis, large banks had stopped borrowing from each other regularly in the unsecured interbank market. There weren't enough real transactions to anchor LIBOR to reality. The rate was still largely based on estimates, and estimates can always be manipulated. Regulators around the world began developing alternatives, transaction-based rates like SOFR in the United States and SONIA in the UK, benchmarks derived from actual market activity rather than bankers' guesses. In 2017, the FCA announced that LIBOR would be phased out entirely by the end of 2021, later extended to mid-2023. The death of LIBOR wasn't mourned. The benchmark that had once been called the world's most important number would disappear, its legacy forever tainted by the scandal that exposed how fragile trust in the financial system truly was. But the transition was staggeringly complex. Hundreds of trillions of dollars in existing contracts had to be amended or renegotiated. Legal disputes erupted over who would bear the costs of transitioning to new rates. The process took years and billions of dollars to complete. In a sense, the world was still paying for LIBOR's corruption long after the fraud had been exposed. What lessons should we take from this dark business story? The LIBOR scandal reveals something profound and disturbing about modern finance and the nature of power and greed in the 21st century. First, it exposes the mythology of market efficiency. Economics textbooks teach that markets self-correct, that prices reflect true value, that fraud will be discovered and punished by the invisible hand. But LIBOR manipulation continued for years, in plain sight. affecting the most important price in global finance. The market didn't catch it. Regulators didn't catch it until journalists and academics raised questions. The invisible hand was nowhere to be found. Second, it demonstrates how easily financial culture can become criminogenic when incentives are misaligned and oversight is weak. The traders who rigged LIBOR weren't psychopaths or outliers. They were ordinary people responding to the incentive structures around them. When bonuses depend on fractions of a percent, when competitors are doing it, when compliance is weak and management looks the other way, fraud becomes normalized. It stops feeling like crime and starts feeling like smart business. Third, the scandal illuminates the profound problem of too big to jail. When financial institutions become so large and systemically important that prosecuting them threatens the entire economy, accountability becomes impossible. Banks paid fines, but those fines came from shareholders and were dwarfed by the profits made during years of manipulation. For the executives who created the culture of fraud, for the managers who ignored warning signs, for the senior leaders who benefited from manipulated profits, there were virtually no consequences. Fourth, LIBOR manipulation reveals the hidden architecture of extraction that underlies much of modern finance. The wealth and power flowing through trading desks in London and New York isn't created from nothing. It comes from somewhere, from someone. Every basis point of manipulated LIBOR represented money transferred from borrowers to banks, from savers to traders, from the powerless to the powerful. The financial system isn't just an abstract mechanism for allocating capital. It's a battlefield where fractions of percents determine who wins and who loses billions. And finally, the scandal teaches us about the fragility of trust in complex systems. Modern finance runs on confidence. Confidence that numbers mean what they claim to mean, that institutions will honor their obligations, that the rules apply to everyone. When that confidence erodes, when people realize that the most fundamental benchmarks are lies, the entire structure becomes unstable. LIBOR manipulation didn't just cost billions in mispriced contracts. It damaged faith in the system itself, a cost that can never be fully calculated. Today, LIBOR is gone, replaced by new benchmarks designed to be more robust, more transparent, harder to manipulate. But the banks that rigged the old system are still here, larger and more profitable than ever. The executives who presided over the fraud have mostly retired comfortably. The traders who went to prison were mid-level employees, not the architects of the conspiracy. And the fundamental dynamics that enabled LIBOR manipulation, concentrated power, weak oversight, misaligned incentives, complexity that shields accountability, remain embedded in our financial system. New benchmarks might be harder to rig, but they're administered by the same institutions, in the same culture, under similar pressures. The LIBOR scandal isn't ancient history. It's a window into how modern finance actually works, when you look past the press releases and compliance manuals to see what happens in the shadows of trading floors and boardrooms. It's a reminder that the most important numbers in our economic lives, the rates that determine mortgage payments, the prices that move markets, the benchmarks that allocate trillions, are ultimately just agreements between people. And people, especially people with billions at stake, have every reason to lie. So the next time you hear about an interest rate, a market benchmark, a financial index that moves trillions of dollars, ask yourself, who sets this number? How is it calculated? Who profits if it moves up or down? Who's checking to make sure it's real? Because if LIBOR taught us anything, it's that the numbers we trust most are often the numbers most worth questioning. Behind every decimal point in global finance, there are people making decisions, facing incentives, choosing between truth and profit. And when those people work for institutions too big to fail and too powerful to prosecute, when they operate in markets too complex for outsiders to understand and too profitable to reform, the temptation to lie becomes overwhelming. The LIBOR scandal showed us that $350 trillion in global contracts were built on a foundation of gentlemen's agreements and daily deceptions. It revealed that the world's most important financial institutions spent years systematically lying about the price of money itself. It exposed a culture where rigging the system was treated as a perk of the job, where fraud was celebrated with bottles of Bollinger, where the manipulation of global interest rates was reduced to instant messages between traders joking about the fix. And perhaps most chilling of all, it demonstrated that even after the conspiracy was exposed, even after billions in fines were paid and reforms were implemented, the fundamental power structures remained unchanged. The banks are still too big to fail. The traders still face enormous incentives to push boundaries. The complexity still shields wrongdoing. The culture still prioritizes profit over principle. Every morning, new numbers appear on screens in London, New York, Tokyo, Hong Kong. Interest rates and benchmarks that move trillions of dollars and shape the financial lives of billions of people. We trust these numbers because we have to, because the system can't function without trust, because the alternative is chaos. But somewhere, in a quiet trading room in a glass tower overlooking the world, someone is looking at one of those numbers and thinking about how moving it just a few basis points could mean millions in profit. And they're calculating the odds of getting caught against the size of their year-end bonus. And they're remembering that their colleagues at competing banks face the exact same temptation. The lies that nearly destroyed the world ended not because the system fixed itself, but because journalists asked questions and regulators finally acted. LIBOR is dead now, replaced by benchmarks we're told are better, safer, incorruptible. But trust, once broken, is never fully restored. And in the dark heart of global finance, where money is power and power answers to no one, the temptation to lie about the price of everything will always remain. The most important number in the world turned out to be a lie. What makes you think the new numbers are telling the truth? Subscribe and listen to our next story below.